Hello everyone and welcome to the week 1 lecture for consumption, work and the self. The sorts of things that I'm going to be talking about today are ideas about the self. What is the self? We're not going to resolve that question. That's a question that's been going on for eons.
But there are shifts, I guess, in the discussion of that debate about what the self is. So we'll pick up on some of that, but don't feel as if you have to resolve that question. Or if you have, that's fantastic, let us know. Because it's a sociological course that we're doing, then I do have some of those theories which you might have come into contact with already. So symbolic interactionism, and Erving Goffman is the theorist most associated with that, although there are a number of others. And he had this idea that we're constantly performing ourselves and that there's no sort of inherent self apart from the social. So we'll have a think about that. And then there's this idea of subjectivity, which comes up in the 2 readings for this week. And that's the thought about who is this idea of a subject. And you could replace that word with person. So lots of the theorists actually use the word subject, but I guess they're thinking kind of vaguely of an individual or a person. And we'll think about why they might not use that word. And does this idea of a subject have agency? So do we have the ability to act with freedom, do what we want to do? Or are we very heavily, or how heavily, are we shaped and constrained by social structures? Is again an ongoing conversation that probably won't ever be resolved either. And then I wanted to introduce some feminist notions of the self as well. So that's what we're going to do for today. I guess historically, we've had this idea of the self being something that is unified. There's a linear progression to the idea of the self. It's solid and it's ongoing. The self is one of the things that humans do think about the most, but how do they think about it is kind of the question. When you're thinking about the self, what is it that you're thinking about? Could you describe yourself? Does it mean your body? Are you thinking about your thoughts? Does it include your emotions? Are you different today to the way that you were yesterday? So would you describe yourself in a different way today from yesterday, or expect yourself to be the same tomorrow? I guess the thought is, if we're something that is solid, ongoing and nicely unified, nice little package, tidy package, why is it so hard to pin down? Do you have that idea that sometimes you're not quite the same self, or you're not really yourself? Do you know that saying? I'm not really myself today. Sometimes if I'm feeling a little bit discombobulated because I'm stressed or preoccupied about something, then I'll say I'm not really feeling myself today. So what does that mean, and how can I be somebody else and yet still me? So if somebody sees me, I'm still me. I probably sound much like me, maybe a little bit more harried, but still essentially the same. So how come I feel different? What's going on there? I guess the idea is that when we try to pin down the self to exactly what it is not necessarily that easy. As I said, you might already have that sorted. David Hume, in the 18th century, a very big deal philosopher in terms of empiricism. So he was less interested in theoretical stuff, things that we thought about just with our minds. He wanted to actually go out and be able to test the world. So for him, there's the beginning of a scientific tradition in the West. So what he did was go looking for himself, but decided that what he could only, and that's an interesting phenomenon, isn't it? If I go looking for myself, what am I looking for? Am I looking for a mirror? Think about that. Go for a walk and see if you can find yourself. It's an odd sort of thing. He looked for himself and he just found sensations. He found that he could feel things. There was a sense of feeling. There was definitely thoughts and perceptions and certainly emotions, but did that add up to a self? Was there something? He wanted something concrete and tangible because he was an empiricist. He was interested in the concrete. And if it wasn't a fact, if you couldn't see it, and can you see yourself? Or do you see a version of yourself? If you couldn't see it, then it didn't exist for him. He asked, if there is a self, what is the source of it? And that's a good question. He was an atheist. And he was sitting in a time when many people were not atheists. In the West, most people were Christians. So in that particular time, then most people would have said that the source of the self was God. But he was an atheist, so he was questioning that source. And he said that if all ideas should spring from an impression, if we just get impressions all the time, an impression of the weather, an impression of somebody else's presence, how does the self fail to have an impression of itself, or does it? Do we have an impression of ourself? Think about that, Eve. When you think about yourself, are you thinking about yourself as an embodied whole, as something, as your mind, as your brain? What is yourself? His questions kind of echo Eastern philosophy, which dates back much earlier than Hume anyway. And in Buddhism, they argue that the self, there is no such thing as the self. It does not exist. And part of meditation practice is to come to some sort of realization that we have all of these swirling thoughts, but they're not really us at all. So the question then becomes, how did I have, if we have a sense of ourself, but a self doesn't exist, then how do I have a sense of myself, and how do I have a sense of myself as separate and different and unique to everybody else? So that's David Hume thinking about the tangible, the concrete, who's an empiricist. If you can't see it, if you can't touch it, it doesn't exist. Another approach is Robert Howell, a philosophical approach. He was thinking about, what philosophers do. They do a lot of thinking. And he was thinking, well, how can we say anything does truly exist? Generally, we do rely on our perceptions. So it seems to me that, yes, this room does exist. But I guess that's the old philosophical conundrum, that does the tree exist in the forest after we've left the forest, and how do we know, because we're not there? But when can we be said to have perceived something? So if you're thinking about perception, how do you perceive yourself? Do you perceive yourself? What is it? What is there? What is there about yourself? What aspects? Are there particular aspects? Are you more aware of emotions or thoughts? Or are there times when emotions and thoughts are particularly tumultuous perhaps, and therefore you become very strongly aware of them, and other times where they don't seem to exist? And when it comes to perceptions, of course, people have different ideas about that. There's the classic half full, half empty. And then how many logs are there? 3 or 4. So that's interesting too, because people have different perceptions of the same thing, depending on where they're sitting or standing. And do all of those aspects then add up to something that is called the self? So that was his questioning. But in popular culture or popular thinking, we do have an idea of an ongoing and stable self, because we have people say, I found my authentic self, which apparently Oprah Winfrey did, and when she found her authentic self, she became very, very wealthy, which it would be really nice for us all to suddenly find our authentic self and be really, really wealthy, wouldn't it? That sounds quite cool and slightly bizarre to me, but I'm sure there's a bit more complicated than that. But there is this notion that we can go looking for ourselves, and again, think about that oddly. If you go walking and looking for yourself, are you going to find yourself? Will you find your authentic self? People also talk about finding their voice, something that is, again, unique to them, their true voice. You'll see lots of probably memes and stuff on Facebook and other social media sites where you'll be being advised, and it's good, well-intentioned advice, to not let other people bring you down. You're your own person. So there's all these sorts of ideas that are floating around, which does suggest that we are some sort of ongoing, stable self, can be brought down by others and picked up again, but it still suggests a sense of continuity. But is it possible? According to most sociological ways of thinking, it's not. And I guess I should have prefaced the lecture with this, that I'm just offering a variety of thoughts, not suggesting a particular one, leaving it to you to consider what makes sense to you. So this is where we come to symbolic interaction. Symbols are things that stand in for other things, so words stand in for a chair, for example, so it's a symbol. The word chair stands in is a symbol for the actual chair, so that's what they're talking about. That symbolic interactionism is often about talking to each other and using those symbols of words, which we call language. What they're saying is that the way that we think about ourselves is through symbols. It is through interacting with each other and using symbols, usually words. It won't exclusively be words because it will also be body language, for example, or displays of emotion. You know how if you get embarrassed, you go red. So that's another sort of symbol which lets people know how you're feeling. If I go back to that idea of words are symbol, if you come up with that symbol cat, that word, which is a symbol cat, the first thing that comes to my mind is my annoying cat at home, whom I love very dearly, but she also is very, very annoying because the only time she wants me is when she needs something, really. And so that's what comes to mind for me, a very particular cat. Does this sort of symbol come to mind for any of you when I said the word cat? When we throw around various symbols, different things will come into our minds, and that will happen all day long. We won't always know exactly what is meant. Every time we use our mind or our consciousness, images and words are kind of filling in there, as in the example that I just gave. And the point is that those words and images don't just spring from nowhere. They spring from our experience, from our lived experience. All of the stuff that clutters up our minds does not emerge from nowhere. It emerges from the social world. This is what the social interactionists are saying. And one of them, George Herbert Mead, therefore says there's actually no true self apart from the social self. We can't exist apart from socially. There is nothing inherent, nothing there apart from the social self. And as I've thought about this for years and years, and I've gone back and thought about all of the interactions that I've ever had, even those that I don't remember, even when I was in the womb, which, believe me, was a long time ago, even that was a social interaction between me and another body. And as soon as I emerged, as the same with you, there would have been a bunch of people and a social structure you were immediately born into. Often those doctors, but often in the past they've been male and the nurses have been female. So you're born into a social world and the very first interaction is a social one. So that's what he's saying. There is no self apart from the social self. It's worth going away thinking about that and seeing whether you agree. It took me a long time to think, actually there might be a point there. Much of our social interaction is, of course, with language. Because it's how we acquire a sense of ourselves. So we don't have, what he's saying is we don't have any sense of ourselves. That is not social. And it continues over a lifetime. So if you meet different people, then your sense of yourself will change in interaction with different groups of people. And self-awareness, becoming aware of ourselves, is an ongoing and evolving practice, he reckons, of self-monitoring and reflecting on ourselves. And that might be something that we'll pick up and talk about in class as well. How much of self-monitoring do you do, and reflecting on. Does anybody do that? Go to a social event or whatever and then reflect on it afterwards and think about your own behaviour and whether you offended somebody else or whether you were the life of the party? Yeah, I've got a few nods. So that sort of thing, that's what we're doing throughout our whole lives, is what Mead says. And when we're feeling self-conscious, he says in those moments we've become an object to ourselves. We're no longer a subject, we're an object. We're looking at ourselves as I would be looking at a cat. And usually we're doing that in relationship to the social norms. So when we go and reflect on those social interactions, thinking about our own behaviour, usually what we're thinking about, if we're thinking about our behaviour, we're thinking about the social norms, whether we violated them, whether we're in touch with them, whether everything went really, really well. So what he reckons is the subject is the person that says I am, So the reality that we experience internally, but he reckons the me is that object, that person that we're looking at when we're really, really self-conscious, when we kind of step outside ourselves for a minute and we're observing how we're behaving. Not just how we're behaving, but how other people think of us as well. And again, that's all about social norms. When we're reflecting on our behaviour, we are usually doing that as to whether we fit it in okay, whether we've obeyed the rules, even if we don't know what they are. Usually we find out because somebody frowns or doesn't like us in some way. And the me, so the I is the internal awareness, the I, but the me, because that is the object and shaped by the social norms, is always constrained then by the social norms. So we're not going to just do whatever it is that we want to do because we want to have relationships with other people. So we're going to be thinking about the relationship. And that can be both a positive and a negative. It does allow you to adapt to a wide number of situations, because you will go and you'll think about how you've gone along in that social situation and then reflect on it and then change if it didn't work, or keep on doing the same thing if you thought it was pretty good. And then there's another guy called Cooley who has this idea of the looking glass self, and he reckons that the idea of the self, or our sense of ourselves in some way, actually comes from anticipating how we appear in the eyes of other people. We imagine how other people, that's part of the reflection when we go home from a social interaction, is we're imagining or reflecting on how other people have received us. And therefore we're imagining what they think about us. The only way to actually know what they think about us is to ask them, but how often do we do that? But as we're doing that imagining of how people are receiving us, then we get a feeling of self-feeling, I guess, that emerges from that. So we have parents who love us and we have that self-feeling of love. Then we might come across somebody who's annoyed by our presence for whatever reason, and we'll have that sense of, well, we can be an annoying person too. The way in which these symbolic interactionists conceive of the social world is that society is neither static, it's not the same at all, nor is it predetermined. So even though we're born into particular social structures, we will make a difference to those as we are going along. We as human agents are bound up in the creation of our culture and in the creation of our society. So what they say is that society is actively achieved through this patterning. So if I think about that example of somebody being born and there's doctors and there's midwives, and then somebody comes along and says, well, all of the doctors are men and all of the nurses are midwives, let's change that, then we're actively intervening in the social structure and changing it. Now, Erving Goffman, I mentioned earlier, he reckons that social life is a performance, so that we're acting all of the time. And he uses the analogy of a stage. He had an interest in acting, and his sister was an actor, so I'm kind of not surprised that he comes up with this idea. He reckons that we often think about a status, our social status or our position in society as a thing, but what he says, it's not actually a thing. You can't touch it. Think back to Hume, you can't touch it, it's not tangible, it's not concrete. It may have consequences that are quite tangible, so more money, for example, if you're very high status, but status itself doesn't have anything tangible about it. So status, position, social place, your place in the social world is not something to be possessed and then displayed, contrary to what some people do. It's actually a pattern of appropriate conduct that's embellished and well articulated. And he's thinking there about the performance that we put on to display our status. And he calls this impression management. And it fostered, he was talking about this in the 1970s with a book called The Presentation of the Self, and it fostered a whole industry of people in corporations talking about impression management and how to wear your suit and what to wear to give the right image of yourself. So what he's saying, that individuals always try to present themselves as favourably as possible to other people. So we're always wanting to make a good impression. And we're all playing a particular role. So the role that I'm playing at the moment is as academic, but the role that I was playing just before I came into the class when my daughter rang was role of the mother. In other roles, I'm a friend. So, and the same with you. You'll be student here, but you'll be also workers, daughters and sons. So you're all playing different roles, is what he's saying. So think about the roles that we're playing. What he says, if you think about the theatre analogy, is that we have this idea of front stage and backstage. If you go to the theatre and you're not involved in the theatrical production, you've just bought your ticket and you're going to see the show, then you won't see anything of the behind the scenes. You'll just see the performance. And that's what he called the front stage, where everything's beautifully executed, hopefully, if it's a good show, and you enjoy yourself and you become immersed in that performance. And then, of course, what happens is the lights go out, everybody goes home, and then you see the clutter and the mess and the work. And if you're part of that performance, then you'll know all of the work that's gone on behind there. And that, he said, is the backstage. What happens here is that what you'll see is a lecture from the academics, but what you won't see, unless you come and talk to us, I guess, in our offices or whatever, is the work that goes into putting a lecture together. So the front stage is this performance now, but the backstage is the work that's gone into preparing it, the reading and the writing, etc. He thinks about this all the time, that at home, more likely backstage, that's where we can be ourselves, where we can usually relax a little bit. But as soon as we exit the house, we're likely to put on a bit of a show. If we have people coming over, if you're anything like me, I'm more likely to tidy up if I have people coming over than if I am at home on my own. And therefore, that's me putting, again, that front stage act on, pretending that I'm much tidier and cleaner than I really am. Think about that in relationship to social media, which is one of the things that we'll be discussing as well. There have been lots of criticisms, so I've been talking about a range of figures who are involved in this area of social interactionism. So Herbert Mead, Cooley and Goffman is probably the biggest name there, but he wasn't the beginning of it. The criticisms are that the emphasis on the social interactions all the time tends to neglect social structures. I'm not sure that it does, but this is one of the criticisms of it. Psychoanalysts, like Freudians or Jungians or whatever, would claim that there's a downplaying of unconscious motives when we do things, that we might not be so unconscious, meaning we're not really aware of what's going on, not really aware of why we're putting on a show, perhaps. The role of emotions is underplayed as well. And postmodernists would claim that the self that features in symbolic interactionism doesn't even exist either, that social self, interestingly enough. I want to move on now to this idea about the subject. So think of that as an individual person. Sometimes in sociology, because of Goffman's work on this performance, you'll find the idea of actor, when they talk about actors all the time. And there are lots and lots of definitions, and some of those have come up in your readings as well. It's very closely linked to this idea of agency, that we can actually determine our own direction in life, for example, that we can, if we've been oppressed, we can resist that oppression, we can overturn it. I guess the ongoing argument, which probably will never be resolved, as I said, is, do we assume that the subject have full agency? Can I do whatever it is that I want to do in the world, is the question? Or some sort of limited agency? Are there social structures that will constrain me, stop me from doing some things that I want to do? Or am I completely victimised and have no agency whatsoever? Completely oppressed. And amongst sociologists, there are varying positions, and what I'm going to talk about today are two of those positions. So it is this idea, ongoing argument about structure versus agency. I quite like this quote from Marilyn Fry, who's a feminist, that is, if you think about a structure, again, it's not something. What she reckons it is, it's a network of forces and barriers which are systematically related and which conspire to the immobilisation, reduction and moulding of women. So this is coming from her position as a feminist and a number of years ago. I've added in there and other oppressed groups and the lives that we live. So from the point of view of somebody who feels oppressed, then a social structure is kind of the forces that are keeping Some people oppressed are not as free as others and not as powerful. Agency, on the other hand, is the ability to resist and to defy those social structures. So if you're a woman who's been shaped to be the nurse instead of the doctor, for example, but you decide to go and get yourself a medical degree or take on the universities to argue for one, which is what women did in the 19th century, then that's about agency, resisting those forces. And I guess if we're going for a small amount of agency or hardly any agency, then what we're talking about is social reproduction. We end up with the same sort of patterns continuing over and over again, versus social transformation. And we've seen, since Marilyn Fry was writing, considerable transformation when it comes to women, for example. So in the 19th century, women were arguing that they should be allowed to go to university. Today, there are more women who go to university than men. So that's an argument for social transformation. Now, constraint theory comes from, well, one perspective is that of Emile Durkheim, whom you might come up against in anthropology as well as in sociology. He reckons the subject has very limited choices. He had this idea, rather than talk about social structures so much, he talked about social facts, that there are a whole lot of things that we confront that are predetermined, that are there when we're born, ways of thinking and acting, even down to brushing your teeth, having to pay tax, voting, stopping at the red light. All of those things he called social facts, and they have power over us. There are consequences if we don't participate in those. And what he says is that a social fact is every way of acting, fixed or not, capable of exercising on the individual constraint, keeping us from doing what it is that. So if I want to go really fast and there's a red light, the red light is the constraint. I can't drive as fast as I want to. He says that we have a lot of these social facts. Karl Marx, on the other hand, argues that our social destinies are actually already determined. He reckons where you're born is kind of a matter of a cycle that's already been happening, that human society goes through a series of stages from kind of very primitive communitarianism, people living together harmoniously in a community, through feudalism, which is the idea of a landowner and peasants working for the landowner, through to capitalism, which is very similar to feudalism, except that it's people owning factories and corporations, etc., and people working for them. And then ultimately his idea is that we will cycle back to communism. So where we're born is kind of accidental in that cycle. Other people have an idea that we do have radical freedom, that humans possess the freedom to choose their life, to choose their identity, to choose their self. So people like Sartre is rejecting those social facts as totally constraining us. He's arguing for radical freedom. A critique of that, of course, might be how much privilege you have. I often tend to think that the more privilege you have, or the more resources you have, the more opportunity you have to be as free as you want to be. A little bit more difficult if you need to go and earn a living and you don't have very much education, etc. The rise of post-structuralism from the 1960s reckoned that there is no one singular truth, and this, you've probably grown up with this idea, that there's no one singular truth anymore. Reality, ontology, is being discursively constructed all of the time. We have different meanings, so when I say cat, I'm thinking of a very particular cat. Somebody else has a different meaning of cat. And in different cultures, they'll have completely different meanings. So for me, a cat means an annoying little pest, but somebody that I really love as well. Whereas in another culture, it's more like a rodent and they'll just kill them and eat them. So quite a different meaning. So there isn't one truth about a cat, is my point. And there's not one truth about anything, really, if you're a post-structuralist. You're thinking about how language shapes our meaning, and different contexts will have different meanings. And so they also reject the idea of some inherent or essential self as well. There isn't one. There's no true self. So as somebody once said to me, if there is no true self, then why spend your time looking for your true self, which is interesting. But then the criticism of that is, if the subject does not exist, how can change ever happen? How could we ever have social transformation? And I've already given you an example of social transformation that we know has. So reviving the idea of the subject are two sociologists, Anthony Giddens and Pierre Bourdieu, kind of two of the biggest names. Giddens is an Englishman, he's still alive. Pierre Bourdieu was a Frenchman, and he's no longer alive. Very huge names in sociology, very popular. Giddens, I think, is now Sir Anthony Giddens. He got on the right side of the Blair government and was knighted for services. What they're interested in is this age-old argument again. It's age-old, looking for the self, nature versus nurture, been around forever, structure versus agency, been around forever, going to go around forever. But these two are trying to think about that as well. So they're kind of our most modern theorists on this topic. Just to remind you of structure not being something that actually concretely exists, but is more this network of relationships, etc. And agency is the ability to resist, particularly oppressive structures. Bourdieu, we're going to talk about it in a little bit more detail later on, but he had this idea of habitus. And again, he's trying to reconcile those two ideas of structure and agency. From his point of view, when we grow up in a particular home environment or school environment, that's actually we're going to or country environment, we're going to internalise a whole lot of ideas, and that will form the structure of our mind. So when I grew up in the 1960s, when the situation for women was very different to what it is now, it was just at the beginning of the second wave feminist movement, then I internalised in many ways ideas of what women should do. Very few women worked in the workforce, very few women went to university. The majority view was that women stay home and look after the children. So many women at that time would have internalised that idea of what women should do. Because things have changed so much, women born today will have a very different internalisation of what women should do. What he's saying is the way in which we grow up, which will be our family situation, whether we grow up in the upper class or working class, that's going to shape our thinking. The particular time in which we grow up is going to shape our thinking, and the particular culture as well, or country. He reckons there's not an objective culture out there, not something you can touch, but it's all of the values and beliefs are internalised through the discourse and even through the way that we use our bodies. Think about how you learnt how to use your body in a particular way. So he reckons that habitus constrains us, doesn't necessarily determine what we can do, we can change that. However, it does often mean that those people who've been dominated then become complicit in their own dominance. So if I go back to that example of 1960s women then become the ones who do the nurturing, don't go to university, and it's like it becomes their choice. So it's like they then become complicit in their own dominance. Giddens, on the other hand, so habitus is a lot about structure and how we take that in, less about how we change things. Giddens, on the other hand, puts a lot more emphasis on the agency side of stuff. So individuals are not seen as unconscious idiots just going around internalising how women are supposed to be, for example. We're actually thinking about that as well. So if something doesn't fit, then maybe we won't behave in the way that society suspects. So he reckons that individuals consciously make decisions that will influence and shape that social structure. Structures can't actually exist, social structures can't actually exist without human input because they're social structures, so they need us anyway. And our actions are always impacting on them. So we produce it, it's reproduced over time, but it's also changed over time as well. So structures can enable our actions as well as disable or constrain us. So he's more interested in what the individual can do to change things. Bourdieu is more interested in how we're dominated, I guess, by the ways in which we're raised. The idea of the postmodernist subject comes up in the reading, particularly James Flax, who is interested in the way that we can change. Everything's flexible. We can change over our lifetime. You will have probably already done that. Structures are no longer solid. Nothing's solid anymore. There's a guy called Bowman who talks about the liquid society, everything now is very, very flexible. So there's no inherent self. We will change over time. We're not the only one. Power is not going to completely trap us in any ways. We're part of a network of power. So if we want to make change, we can do that, and that will shift. So power is not just about people above us constraining us at all. We're part of a powerful network. And to come to Jane Flax, so she refutes totally that idea of a unified, singular human nature that I talked about right at the beginning, which goes back a long way, probably at the beginning of the Enlightenment in Western history, and reckons that we're very, very complex in actual fact. And she's talking from the perspective of philosophy as well as sociology, and also as a psychoanalyst, because she has clients that she works with, so she experiences firsthand the complexities of what makes up a human being. All of this complexity includes our temperament, whether we're calm or might be more volatile perhaps, our particular orientations to the world, whether we're more outgoing or ingoing. We do have biological vulnerabilities and needs, our capacities for creative thought, our ability to work, our language skills, all of that is part of us. So we're very, very complex, is what she's saying. And how we got to this particular point is a complex process as well, which I'd like us to discuss in class. But it's also in a constant state of flux. So if you think about coming to a class like this and getting a whole lot of new information, then you're probably going to go out feeling slightly different to when you came in, because you'll have information to reflect on, perhaps to reject, but perhaps also to take on board. So subjectivity or habitus. So by subjectivity, Ortner, who's part of the readings for this week, is talking about this whole complexity of perception, affect, which is emotion, our thinking, the desires that we have, our fears. So it is all of those things that we feel individually, but it's even more complex than that, because it's also shaped, as I said, as Bourdieu says, by the culture and by our family situation, by the schools that we've gone to, etc. So we're very, very complex because of all those influences that we've come across. And her idea, which was shaped by Bourdieu, is very similar to the idea of habitus from Bourdieu, which comes from another guy, Norbert Elias. So these people are interested, as I am, in that interrelationship between the psychological and the social. For me, I would reject just the social and just the psychological. I think it's the interplay between the two that has the most value and is the most interesting. When we're talking about the subject, and I'm thinking here, it doesn't happen quite so much in readings these days, but when I was a kid, when I mostly read anything, there was the word man in there, and there was this idea of the universal, that man stood in for humanity. But as feminists unpack that, they said, well, actually, no, really man equals man. It doesn't include woman. So we've got to think about who this person is, all the time, who's the subject. Are we talking about the classic white middle-class man? Have we included different groups of people? Often the subject is assumed to have a set identity and capacity, and can be, I think the most important point here, is the idea of the subject has, in the past, often been created by excluding groups of people. So not just women, but homosexuals, for example, and not just women and homosexuals, but different racial groups. So we've got to think about the idea of the complexity of the subject there as well. Who are we talking about? Are we talking about Westerners? Are we talking about non-European people? Who are we talking about?
In sociology, there's a really important article by Candace West and Don Zimmerman, who are Americans, who wrote an article back in 1987, which is really important when it comes to thinking about gender. So it's been one of those formative articles that I wanted to make sure that you knew about. And they begin this 1987 piece by talking about the beginning of the women's studies and gender studies movement. Mostly that was women's studies in the early days. Later on it transitioned into gender studies. And they say, and I'm quoting, in the beginning there was sex and there was gender. Those of us who taught courses in the area in the late 1960s and early 1970s were careful to distinguish one from the other. Sex, we told students, was what was ascribed by biology, anatomy, hormones, physiology. Gender, we said, was an achieved status, that which is constructed through psychological, cultural and social means. They go on to say that this was somewhat confusing for students, and now what they want to do is talk about gender as, and again I'm quoting, as a routine, methodical and recurring accomplishment. They go on to say, we contend that the doing of gender is undertaken by women and men whose competence as members of society is hostage to its production. Doing gender involves a complex of socially guided, perceptual, interactional and micro-political activities that cast particular pursuits as expressions of masculine and feminine nature, end of quote. So they ended up deciding that rather than just having sex and gender, there's sex category and gender, where sex is the determination made when a baby is born through the application of what they say is socially agreed upon biological criteria, usually genitalia and also chromosomes. So some sort of determination is made when we're born and we're put into usually just those binary male-female categories. And that sex category is then established and sustained, they say, by the socially required identificatory displays that proclaim one's membership in either one of or other of the categories. And think therefore about babies. So it's been determined that it's a male or a female. And then usually mums and dads will do something to make sure that other people identify that child in one or the other of the categories. Often putting, boy clothes for boys, often blue or pink for girls. And think about the idea of the gender reveal. Already there's a sex category established for children. And then gender, they say, is managing situated conduct. So, we have different conduct that's required in different situations. So managing situated conduct in light of normative conceptions of attitudes and activities appropriate for one's sex categories. So gender activities then emerge from and bolster claims to membership in a sex category.
Just before we finish, the idea of performativity comes from Judith Butler, rock star feminist academic. In the 1970s, feminists made a distinction between biological sex and gender as being what we learn socially about being a man or a woman. And what she said was that no, sex and gender are both mentally or socially constructed labels. People don't have a sex, don't have a gender, they do gender. And in the process of doing gender, then they will throw like a girl, for example, or work or walk like a man. So that complicates the whole idea about the person or the subject or the self once again. So she's saying as well that the self is entirely socially constructed. And the advantage of that for many people is that if it is, then they're not constrained by the way that society has said they must behave. If there is nothing inherent about being a man or a woman, then I can just do whatever I like. And so we see a lot of variety in terms of gender identity now than we ever have before because of this idea of fluidity. That's my references. I put a stack of references there for you. So what I've done is just gone through a whole lot of ideas around the self for you to be thinking about. Particularly think about, if you could, whether you agree with the idea that there's no inherent self and whether you are totally socially constructed, basically, through interactions. And if you can come up with a time where there was nobody, no interaction, no social interaction, do make sure you tell me, because I've been racking my mind and I can't come up with a single one. Thank you.